Hello and welcome to this video for Eckhart Yoga. My name is David and the title of today's talk is Sweet Chariots. And the title that I've chosen comes from one of the most used and perhaps most beautiful metaphors that we have in yoga and that you may have often heard from a teacher in class. And this is the metaphor of a chariot, a charioteer, and the chariot being pulled by 5 horses. And quite possibly the earliest use of this metaphor comes out of the Upanishads and from the Katha Upanishad. And the Upanishads are a sort of collection of old Indian scriptures, and they form part of the Vedas. And the Vedas are basically a collection of 4 collections of text, of poetry, of wisdom, of ritual that were written a few thousand years ago in India. And they are seen essentially as the root texts for a lot of Indian scripture of the things that we now consider yoga texts, like the Bhagavad Gita. And essentially the Vedas are made up of, there's a lot of stuff in there. There's a big part in there that is essentially around ritual and practices. And these are rituals and practices that are still used or form the basis of many Hindu rituals and practices today. So these can be seen as a very specific sort of knowledge that's been passed down. And other parts of the Vedas, and these are generally much smaller parts, concern essentially what is wisdom, and it's generally considered non-specific or universal wisdom. And it is this wisdom that is now passed down or been extracted in the form of the Upanishads. So that's the context. That's where this metaphor is coming from, and it's coming from one specific Upanishad, the Katha Upanishad. And in that Upanishad, what you've got, it's a really nice story, and it's a story about, or it's a tale about a very wise, very aware young man who gets to meet death. And in getting to meet death, the young man gets to ask, or is granted, 3 boons, 3 questions that will be, or 3 requests that will be, that death is obliged to deliver on. And the 3rd of those boons, or 3rd of the requests that the young man puts to death is essentially, tell me the answer to the big questions of life. What is the nature of self? What happens to me after I die? So the really big questions, the stuff that all sort of universal knowledge addresses. And it's in death's reply to that question that this metaphor comes up. So let's move to the board, my friend the board, and we'll look at this metaphor in a bit more depth and how it plays out in our practice of yoga. So here we have a rather inept but hopefully sufficiently clear diagram of this metaphor. So this is the chariot, the charioteer, and I put ×5 because there's ideally 5 horses, but I don't have the space or ability to draw 5 horses, so I've drawn 1 and a ×5. So in this metaphor that Death uses. Basically, he says what you've got to think of is that the body is the chariot. The intellect is the charioteer. The desires or the desiring mind are the reins, and the 5 horses are the senses. So this metaphor is used for, how we conventionally go around our lives, which is driven, the body and mind, or the body and the intellect get pulled along by stimuli from the senses and the response of our desires and our minds to this senses, to this input from the senses. And what essentially Death says to the young man is, as long as you operate, behave, think of yourself, as the body, and letting the body and intellect be steered in this way, then you are destined to a life where you're essentially bouncing backwards and forwards between pleasure and pain in the pursuit of selfish desires, which is not a particularly enjoyable way to go about life, but a lot of us do it for a long time or a big period of our lives. So further on to the, because the young man says, okay, well, how do I move away from this cycle? How do I come to a fuller expression of self? And Death essentially says, you've got to do 3 things. You've got to focus the mind. You've got to grow discrimination. And you've got to purify the heart. So by focusing the mind, basically what he's saying is, if you think back to that picture of the reins and the horses, is not to, and the charioteer, is not to let the charioteer and the reins that the charioteer is holding purely be distracted by everything that comes in through the senses. You've got to learn to focus the mind. Through focusing on the mind, you grow your discrimination. You learn to discriminate essentially between what is real and what is not real. And through this process and through seeing things for what they are, you start to purify the heart, which means the impulse from inside to start chasing these selfish desires is less so. And these are essentially 3 processes or 3 processes we go through, or 3 qualities that we grow when we're practicing yoga on the mat. So very clearly there's a focusing of the mind element. We're learning to focus our attention on either the breath, or hold our attention on the movement of breath. We're holding our attention on sensations in the physical body. We're growing our discrimination. We're learning, through that learning to observe, we're learning to discriminate between sensations that are purely uncomfortable or just uncomfortable, and sensations that are warning signs of pain or not good. We're growing discrimination, feeling into, okay, that's an inhale, that's an exhale. So it's very, very simple but very real stuff that we're learning to discriminate between. And as we go through that process of growing our discrimination, we also start to get into the mind stuff and start saying, I'd always assumed that was real, but actually I see it's just a story or a voice in my head. So we're growing our discrimination and purifying our hearts. also a key element or key component of our practice on the mats, as we learn to let go of our desire for achieving, for reaching somewhere, for getting somewhere as we practice yoga on our mats. Letting go of that is an opening of the heart, it's a purification of the heart, which also starts to pan out more widely. So those are the three things, that Death told the young man to focus on. Coming back to this illustration or this metaphor of the body as a chariot, the charioteer and the reins with intellect, desire, and mind, and the 5 horses as the senses. Death tells the young man one more thing. He says, know thyself as the Lord of the chariot. Know thyself as the Lord of the chariot. And by that, Death does not mean the little charioteer here. And this process of investigating who or what is the Lord of the chariot is essentially one of the deeper questions we get into as we practice yoga. So maybe I'll just wrap up this talk with a question, which is simply to give you a direction or an inquiry for your practice. And this is a direction and inquiry that can last a lifetime. It's, where is the Lord of the chariot? So where is the Lord of the chariot? Okay, so thank you for joining me. As always, please leave any comments in the comment section, and I will see you next time. Jai Ganesh.